for what we call mastering the middle distance. So focused on hopefully giving you some good training advice, some general knowledge on middle distance racing. We decided to do this quite early season because a lot of you maybe are already entered an event or thinking about doing an event, rather than wait till we've done it in the past February, March, and you've kind of already done a lot of your training or realised, oh, I need to start doing my training. So hopefully there's some good things in here. I will try and keep this to as close to an hour as we can. I will probably waffle in a few tangents in between, but I'll try and keep it as close to time as we can so you're not here till 9 o'clock at night. So generally, hopefully you know this, if you've entered one especially, the distance, just to kind of give you context, it's a 1.2 mile swim, bikes 56 miles or 90k, runs a half marathon or 21k. Always obviously called half middle distance, heaps of names for it. Kept it to middle distance so we don't get slagged from or get sued by Ironman for calling it 7.3, but it's a 7.3. How long does it take? Depends. If you're a pro man and you want to win the Ironman half championships, you need to be looking at 3.5 hours. If you're a female, 3:53, and you can see obviously the times in there are quite quick. For everyone else, average time is, I would say, like amateur times. Anything from 4 hours to 8 hours is still relatively good. I mean, anything you get under 8 hours is still a pretty hard day out. Obviously, it does vary. You can swim anywhere from 26 minutes to an hour 10. You can bike anywhere from 2:30 is pretty good, although some of the pros are, sort of good amateurs are getting closer to kind of 2 hours that the pros are doing. Anywhere up to 4.5. And then for the run, anything from an hour 20 on a half marathon up to 3 hours is generally considered still relatively good. And everything else in the middle, where I'm sure we all sit. For some people, they might be 1 hour 10 in the swim, but then 2:30 on the bike, and then maybe a 1:30 run. And it depends. There's so many permutations of that, which makes this really difficult to kind of focus it on. But we'll hopefully get there some stuff. So just thinking in terms of the event, I think for a lot of us, it's an endurance event. It's a very long endurance event. Speed's probably not going to limit you across anything. Now, you might not be fast, but how fast you can go across a swim, a bike, and a run is probably not necessarily limiting you in terms of your overall performance. Now, it does become a limiter, but it's not usually the limiter for most people. It's how long you can keep going for. It's more of a big thing. But I think sometimes people think of triathlon in general as swimming, cycling, and running. Triathlon is one sport. How well we do one sport is how well we do all sports. They all interact with each other. So if you're not a good swimmer, it impacts your bike. If you're not a good runner, it impacts your run, and vice versa. So you want to think of it as one sport, not three sports. So training for triathlon is generally in one sport. How important is the swim? And do you want to guess? How important do you think it is? Maybe not just in general, but for the event.
Not very important.
Not very important, is it?
Unfortunately.
In terms of percentage of the time it's going to take, it's probably not that important, because it's quite a small part, but does have a big impact on your race. If you're not an efficient swimmer, you can often end up, it can impact your bike and run. Even if you're a good biker or a good runner, it still has a big issue. But generally speaking, how much gain you can make in swimming is probably a couple of minutes for most of us. Unless you're an hour 10, maybe you can gain 20-30 minutes in the swim. Just out of interest, who's actually entered an event? Just quick show of hands, who's actually got quite a few. Which ones?
Jordan.
Okay, yeah, cool.
Aberfeldy.
Aberfeldy.
Weymouth.
Weymouth, okay.
Who else?
Lakeman.
Lakeman, okay, yeah. So not confirmed, but just maybe after today. Either yes or no.
Portugal.
Yeah, I guess it's a. So into that, how important is the bike? For a half. Very. Probably the most important thing. It's the thing you're going to spend the longest time doing, even if you're a very good. Although there is instances where someone's bike might be slower than their run if they're a really good biker or not a good runner, but 9 out of 10, the bike is the longest element, and it's usually longer than both the other two combined, which ties into what the training we want to do. How important is the run? Quite, yeah. So we're good numbers, like it. But the key thing with triathlon in general, but more so as we go into middle and long distance, the ability to run on fatigue is more important than how fast you can ultimately run. And you'll often see it with some people, they're not maybe a fast runner, but they run relatively well on tired legs, and they can actually hold a good percentage of what they can run outright, rather than where some people can run really fast half marathon, and then they're 2 hours for a run off the bike, which does become an issue. Obviously the fourth discipline, which is hopefully I can give you some advice, so I've tried to make this hopefully specific, hydration is spelled right, specific to 7.3. The problem is with nutrition, it's kind of a talk on its own, which is why we've got a talk, I think in December, I think off the top of my head, if anyone's interested in endurance fueling, but I have got some stuff in there that's hopefully useful. So we've got events, or we're thinking about entering an event. I always think you want to start with setting your goals. So we start in kind of fairly standard to most things, setting the outcome goals. people often get confused when I say this, is like, actually your outcome goals you're not in control of. That's your positioning time or positioning place. So that's saying I want to do a half Ironman in 7 hours, 6 hours, 5 hours, 4 hours, whatever. That is an outcome goal, but you don't have control over that. If the event is really hilly, really tough, maybe it's harder to do a good time. If the weather on the day is really tough, it's not necessarily going to happen. So we need to be mindful of that as well. And ultimately, finishing top in your age cat, top 10 in your age cat, whatever, or top 50th in your kind of respective gender or age, isn't in your control either. Unfortunately, you could go to an event where the best people in the world turn up and you can have the best race of your life and still not hit that goal. So we do need to be mindful of setting that as a goal. Anybody here just set a goal of I just want to finish? That's a good question here. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Because when someone says to me, I just want to finish, and I don't want to make sure I get this right, so don't critique anyone saying that. If I say to someone, I just want to finish, like, let's get off the bike and walk. Let's just take 3 hours to do the run. People don't want to do that. Because there's always an expectation of, they kind of know what they want to achieve, but they don't necessarily want to say it. They just want, like, yeah, you have to be able to finish, but you want to set a goal that's going to be a challenge that is what you perceive to be your best on a given day. So I think if you just say, and marathon's probably the classic example, I just want to finish the marathon. Well, go and walk it. Go and walk for 7 hours. Nobody wants to do that. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but you go there, you're better to say, right, I think the best day I can have, or a good day I can have, would be to do 7.5 hours. What does that look like? Can you split that into the discipline rather than just go, I just want to finish? Because then you'll never be satisfied with what you do. Because you'll do a good time, you might do 6 hours and be still peeved off because you think you could have done 5:45. But if you say you just want to finish, it doesn't matter. But it does. We always have that. Flesh these out into the single discipline. So what pace do we need to swim? And again, still high level to be able to hit the target time. What does that look like? So if we think we're going to do 50 minutes in the swim, what pace is that? If you don't know, we can work it out. What pace or power needed on the bike? Bike's always a wee bit harder because it's not necessarily always relatable. It depends on bike skills and things like that. And sometimes you can't necessarily pace, but you can go by a rough average speed is maybe a good target. And what pace to run the target time? So for example, if you want to run 2 hours off the bike, you need to run about 9-10 per mile, or kind of 6 minutes per kilometre roughly, give or take. So then from that we take those goals. So obviously we're not into this specific 7.3 stuff yet, but we're now looking at, right, we've taken our outcome goals, I want to do a certain time, I want to try and get in a certain place. What are the processes for that? And this is something usually nobody does that well. We have some general goals, which I think are really important. Might be we need to prioritise better nutrition. That's day-to-day nutrition. That's making sure we eat better and don't just go for the junk food options. Getting sufficient sleep is probably a limiter for some of us as well. Certainly if you've got kids, that can be the biggest limiter, is actually getting enough sleep. But if we can improve it in some way, that's going to help us, and that's a good thing to work towards. Improve swim technique. That's usually a key thing that we can actively do that. We can do drills, we can get help with our swimming or whatever it is, watch more videos on YouTube to help improve swim technique. Swim X number of times per week, maybe it's twice, maybe it's 3 times, maybe it might just be get to the pool once a week, or get to the pool at any time. Might be sometimes our issue, and I've always put that one there, because swimming for most people is the thing they least enjoy. If we can learn to enjoy it, maybe not completely, but we can enjoy it some ways, that usually is going to help us improve our swimming. So that might be right, I need to figure out what I need to do to improve my swimming by enjoying it. It might be you join a club, it might be that you go with a friend, whatever. That's a way that you're more likely to do more of it, and you'll probably improve. Improve bike handling skills. Triathletes are notoriously bad at bike handling skills because they never do it. They sit on a turbo all winter and get really strong, and then they go out to the first race and go around the corner and then take out 3 people, and then they usually stay on the bike. Working on your skills and bike handling is really important, certainly if it's a more technical course. But I would say if you can improve your skills, you're probably going to improve your biking. And that comes from when you get out on the road, being comfortable, even riding in groups, although you're not necessarily racing in a group. And 9 times out of 10, you come out to swim with 50,000 million other people. You're going to have to learn to negate people that are probably worse bike handling than you are. So definitely working on some of that skills, braking, cornering, even just being able to reduce how much time you have to slow down. Maybe you might want to set a goal of, I just want to be able to cover the distance, or just be able to sit on my bike for 3 hours. If you think the bike's going to take you 3+ hours, that's a good process goal to set. Something that, again, a lot of triathletes don't think about, learn to fix basic bike problems. Like, you're not going to become a bike mechanic, but can you fix punctures? Can you sort gears if you have an issue? What happens if your saddle slips? All these little things that they potentially derail your race. If you get a puncture and don't know how to fix it, that could be race over, and you spent a fortune to get to the race, spent all this time training, and that's what derails you. That was very, very frustrating. Because you could actually have a puncture and still have a good race. But if you have a puncture, you can't fix it. Race is done. Doesn't matter how fit you were. You could be on for a PB or whatever. So that's definitely important. And then run. Simple things. Maybe you focus on holding good form under fatigue. So you do some runs when you're tired, or brick runs, which we'll come into in a little bit. Improving hip strength. Usually 90% of the time, we're going to help runners in general. You'll see most people as they get off the bike in Ironman or 70.3, and they're shuffling, everything's going, knees are collapsing, they're putting a lot of load through their hips, and it's just because they don't have the strength to be able to run when they're that tired. Again, that comes with just time and improvements. There's always, I see, there was an Ironman a couple of weeks back, people running in carbon shoes, 350 whatever there are now shoes, and they're running 4.5 hours. Probably not a good option. Probably better going for something a little bit more comfortable, because you see it, the shoe's collapsing underneath them, and they're putting so much load through your knee and hip. Now, if you're a 3-hour marathon runner, probably get away with it. You're probably a good enough runner to get away with it. There is this risk of it. If you don't have the strength in the feet and the hip, and you're not running fast enough to probably gain from the shoe, it's probably detrimental. The last thing you want to do is get halfway through the run and have a knee problem, or even in training, which is a big issue for a lot of us. So in terms of training, I'm going to go in a bit more detail in training, but how much training should we do? Does anyone have a guess? How much training? We're training for middle distance. How much training do we think is a good number? Show some numbers.
More than what I'm doing right now. 5 to 7 hours a week.
Okay, 5 to 7. Anything else? Sorry, just random numbers. What do you think?
Depends on the athlete.
Depends on the athlete, yeah. Anything else? And do you want to throw a number at just, or is everybody scared to get it wrong? 10 hours a week, okay. So the first question is that, how much training can you do? Like, there's no point in me saying, yeah, you need to do 6 hours a week if all you've realistically got is 3 or 4. Or likewise, there's no point in saying, yeah, I need to do 15 hours and you haven't got 15 hours. How much training can you realistically do? And I would say with that, what's your training history? How much training have you been doing? If you've been doing loads of hours, you can probably do more hours. If you're doing very little hours and you've just done, the last year you've maybe just done your first triathlon and you want to step up to a longer distance, and you've generally only been doing 5, 6, 7 hours, obviously only but doing 5 or 6 hours, maybe you only want to add maybe an hour or two to that. Maybe you can't. Maybe you can't add any more hours. Maybe that is all the time you've got, and you need to factor that in as well. But most of us are going to be time limited. We're going to be driven by, we've got work, we've got kids, we've got other things, we've got life outside of triathlon. I don't think any of us here are getting paid to do triathlon as a sport, so we're going to have to do the other things that are usually frustrating and take our time, but that's the reality of us. But what comes back to, how do we get, whether we've got 10 hours or 50 hours to train, how do we get the most bang for your buck? And do you want to guess?
Very fast bike.
Sorry? That does help, yeah. Long as it's from here. Yeah, anything, you think, what's the biggest thing you can do to improve your training? In terms of intensities and...
Aerobic.
Sorry?
Aerobic.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Good, you must have been at top 4. 3/4 of your training, generally speaking, it's not an exact number, should be in zone 2. Now I'm going to come into what is zone 2, because I think a lot of people say this is do zone 2 training and don't really know what it means, so hopefully demiss that a little bit. Generally speaking, if you're going to do anything or one thing, focus on just building endurance. That's probably going to help you. If it's just the goal is just to get around in a relative time, that's probably going to be a good thing that's going to help you most of the time. Now, if you are time limited, sometimes you have to maybe increase a little bit, but we'll go into that a bit more. The balance of training is the hard thing to get right. How much training should we focus on percentage-wise, swim, bike, run, do we think? So we've said before how much we think the swim, bike and run are relative. How much percentage should we do on the bike? Just rough number.
60.
Sorry?
60.
60, okay. 50? More or less? Don't know. Now again, not exact, it depends on a lot of things, but general rule of thumb would be a good target is, so if you're doing 6 hours per week, 3 hours of that should probably be focused on your bike. And I would say, not to go into all the training bit now, because we're going to go into that, but if you have only got 6 hours to train, say aim for like roughly 3 hours on your bike, you're probably going to gain more from doing a longer ride than 3 1-hours, because your endurance is going to improve from that. Now you might not jump straight into 3 hours of rides, but you're better to probably compress, so rather than do 3 1-hours, do 1 1-hour on the turbo a bit harder, and then a 2-hour endurance ride outside, ideally when the weather's better. That's probably going to improve you more than trying to do 3 1-hour mental FTP sessions that Zwift seem to keep throwing out. Then roughly 30% run, 20% swim. Again, if you're a really poor or inefficient swimmer, that's going to go up maybe a little bit. Run, if you're a good runner, you can come down. Or likewise, if you're a really strong biker, come from a bike background, done lots of sporties, lots of time trials, maybe you can afford to bring up the swim and the run, depending on times. I mean, swim is usually the hardest in terms of time intensive, because you have to go to a pool most of the time, you have to get back, it's usually hard to fit in. And again, it's less important, but it does have a factor. But adjust that depending on your weaknesses. but prioritise your time on the bike. Any questions from that? Nope. So, what does the event require? This is something you want to think about, is what is the specific element of the event. So if you haven't entered one, we don't need to worry too much about this yet. But if we have, we kind of can start to look at, right, what does the course look like? What are things I need to be thinking about for the race? So is it a sea swim? Is it a lake swim? That does change the training we want to think about, or the things we need to improve. Is it hot enough that it's going to be non-wetsuit? If you're not a good swimmer, I would probably suggest don't do an event that might be a non-wetsuit. Go and get the benefit of your wetsuit. What's the bike like? Flat, hilly? What's the temperature going to be? If it's Aberfeldy, it's probably going to be raining. Or is it going to be hot? Because that again is going to factor into how you're going to want to train and prepare for the event. From that run, same thing again. Is it loops? That's a good thing to know as well, psychologically to know. And I would even train like that. So if it's going to be 3 loops, do some of that in training just to get used to going round a kind of point, because it's quite hard sometimes to do, certainly if you go into some of these events that are like 10 loops. But the 5th one you're like, how many have I done? And it's like, I've lost count. Getting used to that in training psychologically to get used to going round in the same kind of seeing the same things. Generally the temperature, if it's going to be hot, is a bigger factor in the run. That's where you're going to overheat soonest from that. And nutrition on course. A lot of people don't think about this in advance, and certainly not necessarily right now you have to think about it, but if you know that on-course nutrition is the worst thing for you to consume, you want to make sure that in part of nutrition planning, you're not going to use the nutrition, or at least you know the brand, you've got enough time to buy some of the branding to test it and try it. So now we've done all that, we can do some high-level planning. So basically once you've paid your money, and usually that's quite a big commitment on its own, certainly with Ironman branded events. But once we've got that, we now know the date, or we're looking at the date that that event is going to occur on. We can start to work back from that to figure out what training we need to do and when we need to do it. So we allocate 1 week to race week, that's whatever. And I've got an example here which I've used for kind of June. We want to allow 1 to 2 weeks of tapering. I'm sure we've all heard or read stuff about tapering, but basically it's a reduction in your overall volume. Allow for what we would call specific training, and I'm going to go into this if anyone's unsure, roughly 12 to 16 weeks. It depends on a lot of things, but that range is generally good for most people. But start with a kind of 2 to 4 week of preparation. I'll explain what that phase is and what they mean. Basically whatever's left is the general phase that it goes in between preparation and kind of specific training, so we'll cover them separately as well. Getting this right, or mapping that out on a bit of Excel, on a whiteboard, on a bit of paper, can really help you plan your year better. And I've actually added a thing in here, which is something I always emphasize. It allows you to sometimes negotiate time further down the line when you might need that specific training. So if you're limited now and you know, right, in June I'm going to really need to get longer bike rides in, having that conversation up front to say, look, right, I'm only going to do 5-6 hours this week in the next few months, but then as I get into 12 weeks out, I really need to try and prioritize getting maybe a 3 or a 4 hour ride every other week. They're more likely to accept that because you can then almost negotiate, get a contract, sign it, and then keep it safe for later. But it just saves hassle usually later, rather than go, right, I'm going out again now, I'll see you later, bye. It's more important for Ironman, certainly when the numbers of hours is a little bit higher. But it also gives you a better understanding of what you want to try and do, and just seeing that written down can sometimes make a big difference on, right, I know where I'm trying to go with my training. And if you don't do this, it's sometimes you don't really think about it, you're just launching into training that maybe isn't really optimizing your time. And this is just a quick one. I've just used there's no dates and such as this, and it's not anybody in particular. I thought the peak's probably a wee bit long. Roughly assuming a race sometime in kind of first week in June, I've kind of mapped out where those kind of phases change, what the general focus is. So for me, the prep phase, it's generally just about building your routine, and I'm going to go in a bit more detail with this in a second. Then you want to progress to, right, I'm going to try and build some volume, gradually stretch my volume out, start to focus on technique more importantly. Then I'll start thinking about building strength. Most people start on week 2 and they're starting to do hard intensity training. If you've not done an awful lot and you're just getting back into the routine of maybe had 4 weeks off since your last race, you don't want to launch into high intensity too soon. It'll just unravel you, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail. Then we build through. We want to work on a little bit what we call sustainable speed and power, some resistance to fatigue, tempo, draft race plan, which I'll cover what I mean by that in a minute as well. Then we move into like that specific phase as we go into that longer efforts, kind of getting used to race pace, some tempo. We're then going to dial into race pace, dial in nutrition. Then we're going to do a couple of weeks, 2, 3, 4 maybe, of where we do the biggest volume. Say for an Ironman, that can be generally slightly longer. For 7.3, maybe you want to do 2, maybe 3 weeks where you're really at the kind of upper end of hours that you've got to focus at it. And then we get into kind of tapering and racing. again, high level. So preparation phase. So this is if you're just starting training now, right? Winter training starts this week, next week, whatever. This is kind of where you start. It's just about getting into a routine. It's not about trying to get fit. It's just about, right, let's just establish my routine so I'm getting used to basically the frequency of sessions. So it's right, I think my plan is I can do 2 swims a week, 2 runs, 2 bikes. When do I do those days? That's what that first phase is really about finding. And you might not get it right. Maybe, well, actually, no, I can't swim on a Wednesday, I need to swim on a Tuesday or whatever it is. But once you get that right, it's then easier to keep it going because you build up that habit. It's used to, right, I need to get up early to get to the pool. It might take you 3 weeks of your prep phase to finally get up early and get to the pool. But by the end of that phase, you kind of want to have been able to do that and just get the routine going. Base your target on like kind of what you've been able to do previously. So that's how much training I can realistically do. Can I do an extra swim session a week? Maybe, maybe not. Can I do an extra bike? Maybe, maybe not. Run, maybe not. But if you can, you think, actually I've got an extra hour I can carve out for doing a bike session, that's where you can maybe start testing that and see if it truly does work. Be patient through this phase. You're motivated, you've entered the race, you've paid your money, you're ready to go for it, and then you overcook that first 3 weeks and then you're injured. And then you spend the next 6 weeks trying to come out of injury. Anybody done that? No, I have. I do every year almost. But it's just getting that, like, don't rush into it. You're better to get to the end of that phase, go, right, I'm ready to progress, rather than I'm ready to have a recovery period again. It's really about just routine. Don't be an early season hero. Plenty of that. And as I said there, by the end of this phase, you want to have found your optimal routine of training and session frequency. And there's no real number on how long that should take. Generally 4 weeks would be as long as you would need to do it, but 2 or 3 is usually kind of perfect. And then we progress, provided we've done that quite well, we can progress into some general training. Again, depends on how long this takes, depends on when your event is, but it can be anywhere from, if your event's end of the season next year, it potentially is a really long time. It could potentially be 20, 30 weeks even, although I would usually say you're probably better to find something to do in between. But fundamentally, this first phase, I would say you want to gradually push your volume towards what you think is sustainable. So that's right, I've got my 10 hours, I'm going to gradually over that phase build my volume to that sort of 10-hour range. And it's not a target, you don't have to be at 10 hours, but roughly try and get, right, I'll start off, I'm doing 4 or 5 hours in prep, but over that next 4 or 5 weeks, I'm going to get that volume up to the 10 hours. And keep the intensity relatively easy. We're still not necessarily trying to make you faster yet, we're just getting the volume up, we're just getting the point. Because you might find you get to 8 hours, like, this is all I can realistically do, rather than keep pushing to 10. And I say the amount of folk that go into 10 hours week 1 and realise that actually they just gradually drop off, they get frustrated because they can't do the training they want to do. So yeah, build up that volume first. The goal in this phase overall is just about getting fit, like generally fit, not race fit. You're not going to be firing on cylinders. You're not going to be running race, or you shouldn't be running PBs. Some people might, just if things have done some better training, but it's just about getting your overall fitness up, ready for your next phase when we get into the race stuff. And don't be a February flyer. Anybody see them, or anybody been one of them? Yeah, where they've been like, you go, or you see people, you go to training camp with them March, April, and holy moly, they're on fire, and then they don't race because they're burnt out by April. If you're hitting huge numbers and flying, now not always a bad thing, 9 times out of 10 you're not getting to June, July peak fitness because you can't keep progressing it. And for most people, if you're doing 15 hours a week now in February, can you go 16, 17, 18, 19 when you get to peak phase? Probably not. You're probably just going to start. And a lot of people get to peak fitness too early, and it's quite a hard thing to get right. But I always think if you're patient, start holding back initially, and then you can always progress it from that. Again, by the end of this phase, you want to have improved your weaknesses. So we've got our swim technique, we're flying in the water, feeling great. We've improved the run strength, we've improved bike strength, we've improved all those general weakness areas. Now we can move on to the kind of specific phase. Again, this phase would, for most people, be 12, 16, maybe 20 weeks long. Again, it depends on the race. Sometimes it's less, but sometimes it's more. Again, practice building volume. Plan to be progressive. That's true for all phases and all training. If you can't progress it, which I think I've got here, always ask yourself, how can I progress this workout? So I've seen it with a lot of people, they go and they start doing VO2 max intervals. Not a bad thing to do, certainly in the kind of second or third general phase. But they start off with like 5 times 3 minutes and they can barely finish the session. You're not going to keep getting longer with that. You're just going to start probably getting injured as you try and do 3.5 minutes. Think, can I progress this workout? If it's so hard that you get to the end of a workout and you literally couldn't do another interval, it's probably not progressive and you probably can't progress it. So you're better to back off a little bit and then aim to build it up over that kind of phases. Yeah, pretty much if you can't progress it, you're probably going to get ill, injured, or start going backwards. And then what happens to most people is like, oh, I'm not feeling very fit, I need to train more. And then they train harder and then get injured. So again, don't be an early season hero. It's not all about building the base. I'm going to cover what base means because I think we all know the terminology, but that should be your priority. So what is zone 2 training? Someone want to try and define it? Don't worry if you get it wrong. I won't. Like when we think about zone 2 training, what do we think about? Sorry? Slow, okay. Steady. Sorry for that. Conversational, yeah, okay, it's good terminology. Yeah. Who does zone 2 training? Anybody go out for their zone 2 run and it's not conversational? It's very common. Most people do it too hard in reality. But I'm going to show you a little bit more, go into physiology a little bit to show you what that actually means. But that should make up the bulk, as I said, or roughly 8%, roughly 3/4 of your training should be aimed at building that zone 2, so at conversational points. It's not difficult. Usually the hardest thing is slowing down. And for a lot of people, certainly running is quite hard to do zone 2, you tend to go too hard. You're better to probably do it too slow. I'd rather someone does zone 2 slightly too slow than slightly too fast. Because again, how much can you keep progressing? If it's easy and you get to an hour, you can always go longer, depending on time wise. But if it's like the end of that run, the end of a zone 2 run, you're starting to hurt and starting to be out of breath and struggling to hold the pace, you're probably not going to be able to do an hour and a half, an hour or 2 hours. So it should be fairly easy.
Kevin, can I just ask about zone 2? Like, if you want to go out for a run and really somewhere hilly, it's like so hard to stay in zone 2. Like, what would your
Walk the hills. Certainly initially, I would walk the hills. Walk the hills, literally, it's like discipline, and that's really difficult because you don't want to walk the hills and your average pace on Strava is going to be rubbish. But if it's like, again, it's you, like you're making sure that zone 2 now is harder doing. But you see, like certainly Norwegians, like cross country skiers, like they will literally walk up hills if they need to, and they're probably faster than most of us. I don't care about it. Don't give a start to Strava. But no, generally it's like that. I would say initially. Now the goal would be that over time you can run up that hill without your heart rate or your effort exceeding what we're defining as zone 2. That's the progression. If you get to 6 months in and you're still walking up the hill and your heart is still going high, something's not right. But you should be able to see that progress. And it's the same. You see a very good, say, hill runner. They can run up a hill better than we can, and they can run relatively easy up the hill because their technique and their efficiency is generally better. Or try and even walk up the hill, run back down the hill. You can those are things you can do. Good for strength though. But I'll come into zone 2 stuff in a minute. So yeah, in this phase as well, we're generally focused on improving our overall endurance. We're looking at getting a little bit faster as well. So it's not all base stuff. Bit of strength is really important in this phase as well. Certainly if you're older or you're kind of recurring injuries, doing some strength and conditioning in this phase is quite important as well, and getting stronger overall. Technique, particularly swim, is really important. Muscular endurance, so that's sustaining a comfortably hard effort, doing big gear work on a bike, running some hills is quite important at that phase as well. And that's something I always try and kind of emphasize people here is focus on being able to hold the intensity for longer more than trying to get faster. So the speed comes, we are going to do some speed stuff, but like if you go and do say 5k paced intervals, get better at holding that pace first rather than go in and start doing longer and longer intervals at that. Because you can then always gradually increase the intensity later, but then if you start pushing it harder, you're not necessarily improving the intensity. You're actually just getting better at going harder, and then it's not the same benefit. And that's what often happens with zone 2. They go, right, I'm going to start running my zone 2 runs faster. But if you've not fully adapted to it yet, it's not a zone 2 run anymore. It's then slightly harder, more fatigue. Tempo workouts, again, I'll speak to a little bit about what tempo is. Quite important if you are time limited, so if doing longer hours is harder, you can nudge that power up just a little bit. It's only a little bit above our zone 2 stuff. And also develop threshold. And for a lot of people, doing the intensity on the bike at this phase is better than trying to do a run, because the run's more likely to get you injured. You can do a lot of good quality bike stuff without too many issues. Not to say you can't get injured on a bike, because you can. Same with swimming. It's hard to do high intensity swimming for most of us if you're not technically proficient. You'll just start to slip through the water and get exhausted. You're not actually going any faster. But I would say if you can only do like work on threshold, I would prioritise a bike rather than the run. But main thing here is focus on the things that you are limited by. So if that is technique, prioritise that. If it's strength, prioritise that. If it's endurance, 100% prioritise that. But I can tell you what it will be. Anything you don't like doing, it's probably your limiter, within reason. Now you don't have to go and do 6-hour bike rides if you don't like doing 6-hour bike rides, but if you hate being on the bike for more than an hour, that's probably the thing that's going to limit you at race day. Does that make sense? So here's some examples. Don't steal them all, please. For swimming, if anybody's done any stuff or spoken to anybody, probably giving you advice on these are pretty easy sessions to do. Some aerobic 50s, I love aerobic 50s, great way to work on technique. Certainly for swimming, where technique degrades as we get tired, that's a good way to allow you to focus on technique over a longer, slightly endurance session. It's not a fast effort, it's 50 metres steady, stop, reset, think about technique, go again. Relatively short recoveries, 10 seconds. Want to do a little bit of speed stuff, so 25 metres, with maybe every fourth one you go fast, with a short recovery, 5 or 10 seconds between every 25, puts a little bit of speed in, and then you can go into a little bit of strength endurance or muscle endurance by doing 300 metres with a pull bar and paddles. Or you can do a fairly simple session, 5 times 400 steady swim. All fairly easy, good sessions. Bike, endurance rides, up to 3 hours. It doesn't need to be 3 hours, just generally going longer. Tempo, if you use FTPs, we can speak a little bit about thresholds, roughly 85% of FTP. It's just that above that, I can have a conversation to start to have to pause for conversation. Yeah, so it's kind of comfortably, you could stay in it for a long time, but it starts to get noticeably harder than what your zone 2 rides would be. Or what I would call extensive FTP development, loads of names for it, sweet spot, people might have heard Ken's talk last week, he spoke a little bit about it as well. Doing something like 5 or 4 times 8 minutes at about 90% of FTP. That's a really good session to do to improve your strength and endurance on the bike, because 90% of FTP is hard, but it's sustainable. But as you go longer, it gets harder and harder. So you can progress that quite easily. So you can start by like doing, maybe you might have to start with 6 minutes, do 4 times 6 minutes. Right, I can now do 4 times 7 minutes, 4 times 8 minutes, or you can build this up 3 times 10. You can keep progressing it in a number of ways. Again, try and go longer. Rather than go, right, I'm going to go 96, 97, 98% of FTP, keep holding 90%. See if you can get up to 3 times 20 minutes, or 2 times 30, or an hour. Do an hour at, just like, that's a pretty horrible session, but do an hour at 90% of FTP will improve your biking exponentially if you can build up to that. But not a target, it's just a general range within that. Running, aerobic endurance runs, aiming maybe to get up to 90 minutes. And this isn't just in like December, this is through that, we're building up through that in the general phase. Resistance to fatigue again, 4 times 10 minutes, round about 90% of your 10k pace, roughly. So it's a pace that you could sustain for longer than a 10k. It's probably about what you could run a half marathon at for most people. It's a good session. Or some short hills, 30 seconds, comfortably hard up the hill, not sprinting up the hill yet. But we're just going to get up the hill, focus on good form, build a little bit of strength, so it's great for Natasha. If you live near hills, you can find them easily. I would usually walk back down them, or easy run them, just take loads of recovery, get the quality of that session. You can build that session really nicely into then doing like 5 minutes with a strong, comfortably hard at the bottom of the hill. So you do hill reps up the hill bit, a bit of fatigue, and then to maybe a 5, and you can gradually extend that 5-10 minutes of comfortably fast on a little bit of fatigue. Really good session to build that resistance to fatigue. Again, just some general sessions. Okay, we've done specific training now. So, generally, it's going to be around 12 to 16 weeks, okay, out from the race. Again, this is now about getting race fit. Shouldn't take that long to get race fit if you're already fit. It's harder if you're not fit. But if you've done the general phase well, it's more about, right, I'm just now adding to my already good fitness. I'm just getting used to the race pace rather than anything else. And that's really what it's about. Get comfortable at race intensity. Practice nutrition, practice nutrition, practice nutrition. Really important, make sure you are fueling well. And then you get to this phase especially is making sure you prioritize nutrition before, during and after sessions is important as well. Because it's more likely that you're going to unravel because you're not recovering between sessions. Certainly if you're training multiple times through a week and multiple times a day, it becomes really important. Also, this is quite important as you get into closer to the race. Practice a feed station. So if it's certainly branded events where they have known feed stations, practice that. So like, you know, it can just be your house, you can set up a wee table in your garden or just a wee bag at the end of your drive. Practice like literally walking in, picking up some food, eating it and then running again. Most people don't practice that, and then on race day they start running, they need to slow down to get some food, then they start walking and go, uh-oh, my legs don't want to work again. So if you practice that in training, it's going to help you. And I would say, for I think I've got it here, is planning to walk for short periods and longer runs is a good way to build kind of specific specificity. Certainly if you're kind of a slower or slightly lower end runner, it's more important for Ironman, which I think I said here, because the distance is a lot longer, but practicing that to go, right, I'm not trying to run the whole thing, I'm not trying to rest either, I'm not like, it's not intervals, but I'm going to run to an aid station, take on some fuel, walk for 30 seconds, a minute, and then run again. It's a really powerful way to develop, especially if your run's like hour 45, 2 hours plus, and you really do not lose any time. You will not lose much time at all. Whereas most people go, right, I'm going to run until I have to walk, and then you're walking for 5 or 6k. You're better to break those little sessions into there, and again, if you practice to do that, it becomes quite useful on race day. Again, by the end of this phase, you want to feel like you've prepared the best you can. So you're kind of getting ready to go into the last couple of weeks of training. You want to feel like, yeah, I'm starting to feel ready for the race. You're looking forward to the race, not, oh my God, the race is 4 weeks away and I haven't done enough training. You want to feel like you've kind of prepared well. What was that one? Missed it. So the specific phase, generally speaking, we're doing endurance, longer, steady rides and runs. We're looking to develop our fatigue resistance. Again, these are less intensive, so these are going to be slightly those longer RTF sessions I was saying about building up to. So if you didn't manage to get there in the general phase, it's still quite a good time to keep building them, so you can kind of build them almost all year. Can you get up to 3 times 20? Not saying it's a target, but that's a really good quality session to build towards. 4:15s are equally as good. And you can also include these in longer training sessions. Something that's really useful, again more for maybe Ironman, is in those longer rides doing some blocks of slightly higher intensity. Rather than just go out and ride steady for 2.5 hours, just put some, like hit a hill, ride up the hill a little bit harder, and then cruise for the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes, put a few more little blocks of efforts in. Want to do bricks, okay, running off the bike, MD practice them? Yeah, some people, good, always good. Practice transitions as well, I think I've said here. It's not going to gain you any time, but it can also minimise any lost time. To me, transitions are, everyone's equal. There's not a genetic gain on transitions that anybody has. It's not a fitness limiter either. It's usually just being organised and having a good plan for it. But likewise, trying to save loads of time there that's going to cost you later is also not a good plan. So it's practising it, making sure you're comfortable with it. If it takes you 2-3 minutes longer than you like, fine, as long as you're gaining from that, rather than just, I'm spending 2 minutes there. Because to get that back, that's a lot of time. You time someone running who can run just as fast as you can for 2 minutes, they're gone. You won't see them for a long time, and you're going to have to run a lot faster. But likewise, if it's going to gain, so like going to the toilet, whatever it is, getting changed if you need to, and it's going to make you more comfortable, it's going to make a big difference. Now, if you're trying to win the race, probably don't waste, you want to have 30-second transitions, but for most of us, we're not. So race pace efforts, so again, getting used to doing the stuff at race intensity, getting comfortable at race pace. Maximise swim economy, so it's not necessarily about how fast you can improve your swimming. Now, maybe we've not been able to improve our swimming much. If you can get more efficient at the same pace, which is often what happens as people swim more and do more swimming, they just get more efficient, they don't go faster. If you can do that and develop that into open water, that's probably going to improve your race overall. So don't be worried if your swim pace hasn't improved 1 second over the winter. It doesn't mean you failed. You just might be more comfortable swimming at whatever, 2 minutes, 2:10, 2:30. Now obviously you want to get faster, but it's still better to be, I can comfortably swim 2:30 and get it swimming, it feels like I haven't done anything, than maybe before where you start swimming, it's like literally if I get it swimming 2 minutes per 100, I'm going to be amazed. Or when you get out the swimming full stop, I'm going to be amazed. So yeah, getting more efficient, getting into some open water, a bit of both is really important. Training race conditions within reason. If it's going to be like Ironman Cork was this year, probably don't train in those conditions. Obviously there's some bad impact of that as well, but and if it's going to be roasting hot, you're probably not going to be able to replicate that well in Scotland. Although you can do some things to help within that. But likewise, if your course that you're racing on is likely that it could be windy, don't shy away from going out in the wind. Now obviously if it's the storm we had a couple weeks ago, again don't go in that. But if it's a little bit windy, most people go, oh no, it's too windy, I'm going to go in the turbo. Where actually, even if you're slower, even if you're not able to do the sessions well, that's going to gain you more confidence to know I can deal with being on the bike when it's a little bit kind of unideal. Same with pouring rain. What happens on race day? It's raining. We all can do it on race day, and if we train to do it, we're more likely to handle it better on race day. So within reason, practice in race conditions. Nutrition, we're looking to dial in the nutrition for here. We want to make sure we've got a good plan and we're dialing in that nutrition well by this point. And build your race plan. So I'm going to speak about building a race plan. Not quite on time, but we're good. So just some specific sessions on these as well. So again, I've kept that aerobic 50s. I do that most year round, and for most people, it's a simple session. It's nothing complicated. But then you can add a bit of speed to that. You can do every fourth one fast. That builds a nice little bit of strength. If you want to build more strength into it, pull boy paddles. Do the whole thing pull boy paddles. 2K swimming, quality 2K swim set. Again, you can do fourth one fast, fifth one fast, sixth one fast, every second one fast. You can mix that up as much as you want, which is why I like it. Again, it's still 10-second rest, but you're still focused on technique. You're not just throwing your arms over and hoping you're swimming faster for 50 meters. You're focused on what you're doing, resetting, going again. And you do enough of them, you'll change technique quite quickly. 10 times 200, fairly simple session again. Target race intensity. You'll probably notice that I keep these swim sessions relatively simple. I think swim sessions often get overcomplicated. There's only so many ways you can swim 25, 50s, 100s, 200s. Now sometimes we keep it interesting, but if you're going in there, and I would say if you're doing 10 to 200 and you get bored at 100 meters, focus on something in each length or change it slightly. You know, put a different, maybe speed up for 50 meters or whatever. You can do a lot of different stuff with that. Also include some race starts. Now obviously if you're not necessarily a competent swimmer and you're going to start near the back, still get comfortable going in and going a little bit harder than you maybe will normally, because it just gets you used to that. A little bit of a kind of stramash at the start of the swim, it gets you comfortable knowing that, right, a little bit harder right now, I can slow down and settle in, rather than on race day you're like a frightened rabbit in headlights and you go into the swim and your brain and everything's just overloaded. If you know that, right, I know it's going to be hard for first 100 meters, I can cruise back, you're going to be more confident when that happens on race day. And again, do some efforts at race intensity. You don't have to do the whole swim. I think a lot of people go in, right, I'm going to time myself for 900 meters and I'm going to try and do it at race intensity. You probably won't. It's when you put that number on you, when you've got other people around you, you'll always go find another gear to go. So it don't matter if you can't swim the distance at race pace. It tends to come on race day if you've done most of the training right. Bike. Again, similar thing with the bike. We're looking to do up to about 3 hours per half. Maybe a bit. If you're going to be on the bike for 4 hours, there's maybe a case that we want to extend that slightly. Building some strength intervals into these rides, which I said earlier, again, 5-10 minute intervals, pushing the power a little bit, but not max efforts. Tempo efforts, we can just build onto these. Again, we're looking to go longer than 90 minutes, and that can be like a continuous ride. So do a 2-hour ride with 10 minute easy, and then go into 90 minutes or up to about 90 minutes at kind of zone 3, a little bit harder, and then cool down again for 10 minutes. Quite a good way to get quality out of a slightly shorter session. Again, finish rides, I do this quite a lot with people. They're not fun, even when I do them myself, I don't like doing them myself, but get to the end of a long ride, last 20-30 minutes, just pick it up a little bit. Not fast, you're not trying to sprint for the stop sign, it's just, right, I'm just going to put it up a little bit, because I'm already quite tired, I'm starting to feel the legs a little bit, but learning to just push a little bit more is a really good way to build strength. Really, really important way to build strength. Again, not a max effort, don't get to the end of that ride going, fall off them. Again, hopefully if you've done your nutrition right on those rides, you shouldn't be completely burst. Again, aerobic runs, maybe get up to about 2 hours. Same thing, finish 10-15 minutes with a little bit of effort. Again, just thinking about finishing strong, not sprinting finish. You don't really need to, unless we're trying to win the race, again, we don't need to practice our sprint finishes. If it happens on race day, you learn to deal with it, or you lose, whatever, it doesn't matter. Being able to sprint for the last 100 meters is probably not going to make break your race in reality. Again, brick runs, good easy one, 10 minutes easy, 10 minutes just getting into race pace, 10 minutes nice and easy again. Again, longer race blocks at race intensity, 3 times 20 minutes is a nice kind of 90-minute session to do, so it's an easy warm-up. Say race pace shouldn't feel that difficult in just a run. Obviously you've not done the bike, but you can build that up. Again, you can start. You could do a long brick like that, probably too intensive for most people, but you could do it. Okay, so race planning. Creating a race plan. Who's created a race plan previously for a distance bit? Yeah? What was your race plan include?
I just did what the training Bible told me to do.
Okay, that's alright. Most people don't. I was surprised that most people don't think about it. But the thing I'd say, like, what is a draft race plan? So to me, it becomes like your manual. It becomes that, like, this is what I think I can do on race day. This is what I'm going to try and do on race day. It's not saying you'll do it, but it's giving you a bit of a plan. So this is like what I'm going to pace on. So this is how I'm going to swim. This is how I'm going to bike. This is how I'm going to run. Some nutrition I'm going to have. And this is done ideally towards the end of the general phase. So just as you start changing to the race phase. Because the sooner you do it, the more time you're going to have to adapt it, modify it, change it as your training progresses. Now ideally, you start at general phase and that initial goal, as you said, of just finishing your half Ironman, is now, actually, I think I can do this in 6 hours. I can do 6.5, whatever it is. Then you can modify your plan slightly and say, right, the outcome goal I'm looking for is this, and this is how I'm going to do that. Again, it should be the plan that you are following, rather than just go, right, I'm going to try and swim 45 minutes for the swim, I'm going to try and bike for 3 hours, I'm going to try and run 2. This is basically your process goals on race day. So, right, what do I need to do to have a 45-minute swim? How am I going to sight? How am I going to draft? What does the course look like? All these things are built into your race plan. And the more of that you do, the easier race day becomes, because it's like, that's my plan, I just follow it. I just need to go through that step by step, and I should be likely to have a good race. Think of it like a race manual. And again, that's what you want to bench your race on. I mean, something I was speaking to with kids a wee bit different, but with like elite level racing, everybody gets caught up, right? Well, what place did you finish? Oh, I was like, I was 15th, it was a rubbish race. But if you've set that goal well enough, you can have the best race in your life and be last. But if you've said, I followed that race, I couldn't have done anything better than what I planned, now you'll learn stuff, but it doesn't mean it's always perfect. But you can go, I've raced the best I could have, I followed my plan to perfection. That's a very, very good race. It's usually when you deviate from that plan, I didn't take the nutrition, I went off like a maniac on the run and then blew up. that's where you're kind of now you learn from that as well. But if you have your plan, follow the plan, you get to the end of the race, there's a lot more lessons you're going to take that are going to be positive, even if the race maybe wasn't perfect. Yeah, and even in your race plan, I always ask guys, what are you going to do if you get a puncture? And then I've had people that say, well, just have to stop. I was like, well, the next 6 months you want it, or whatever it is, 6 weeks, learn how to fix puncture. That can, as I say, impact your race and improve your race. Does that make sense? So a bit more into this. So again, these are just some general questions. I'm not going to go into every single one. These are questions I like to ask people. So obviously outcomes. What aside from swim, bike, run are important to achieve your outcomes? What things aside from the sport are going to impact your ability to achieve this? What can you do on race day to impact or improve the race time or outcome? Based on your current fitness, what do you think is a realistic target for your event? That's a really good one. What can you focus on during the leg? So, and even have a plan for what happens if it doesn't go to plan. So if I start to struggle on the bike, what am I going to do? Don't just say, I hope it doesn't happen, because if it does, you're up poop creek. I think if you've said, right, if I know if I start to struggle 2.5 hours in on the bike, right, I can focus on something, right? Maybe I'm going to slow down a bit, I'm going to take a gel, I'll maybe stop at aid station, get some more nutrition, or my nutrition isn't working, which is probably the most common one, right, my plan B is this, I'm going to do that. What things do you think will impact your swim, bike and run on race day? What kit do you need for swim, bike, run on race day? That is a really good thing to do sooner rather than later before your event. It might tell you still need to get some kit. Okay. Oh, actually I don't have goggles that are great for sunny, it's probably going to be a sunny day, I can go and get my goggles. I've got time to practice them. Don't wait till the expo before you buy the goggles that are going to be good, because they might not work. Yeah, bike kit. Hopefully by then you don't think about needing a new bike, because it's probably too late. Again, what nutrition are you going to consume, what and when? That's something you want to put in your race plan. What am I planning to use? When am I planning to use it? The more of that you've got defined, the more likely you're going to have a good race. And what's your nutrition plan be? Because 9 times out of 10, even though it worked every day in training, it was amazing, on race day it doesn't work. You have gastro problems and no reason why. It does happen. It's unfortunate. Again, if you can't do that, or if things aren't going to plan, what can you do to negate their impact? Does that make sense? So, energy. So, obviously it's an endurance sport, so we need energy. This is something that I say I've minimised this a little bit because it's in the nutrition talk a little bit more. Right, some of this hopefully you know, but we have 2 general sources of fuel, glycogen, or carbohydrate, and fat. Yeah? We use them in varying proportions depending on the intensity of the race. Yeah, we kind of know that hopefully. But the fundamental thing that limits that, and I'll show you some examples of how that impacts there, is the intensity of exercise depends on your ability to use oxygen. The better your body is at using oxygen, the more fat you're probably going to burn. If you're not very useful at using oxygen, you're probably going to burn more glycogen, and that has a big impact. So in low intensity, we're going to use predominantly more fat, but we're still probably always using carbohydrate, even at low intensity, even in our zone 2 training. As we go harder, mostly carbohydrate is going to be used, which probably we know. Generally speaking, as we exceed 80% of max heart rate, we're probably using exclusively carbohydrate. Although for 70.3 racing middle distance, hopefully we won't get that for very long. So it does occasionally go up. So there's an example. So a 70 kilo man with 10% body fat has roughly 500 grams of carbohydrates stored in glycogen in the muscle, the liver. You're never going to completely tap that out, but you can get close to using most of it. When you get towards the end of it, that's when you fall off or you have to slow down. Not completely. There is stages to it. But you've got about 7,000 if you're a 70 kilo 10% man. If you're heavier than 70 kilos, you've probably got more glycogen. If you're more than 10% body fat, you've probably got more fat. But roughly 63,000 calories of fat we have available, which is quite a lot, which is why we can probably go for a long time if we go slow enough. So if you go for a walk, you could probably walk for days before you'd run out of energy if you just drank water through the thing. So we do have plenty stored energy for the race. We have plenty. There's enough fuel to get us through even the longest endurance race. We have enough fuel. Our problem is, which fuel are we using, and can we burn enough fat? Because we don't have enough carbs. And basically, if you run, anybody had that before in a race?
Yes.
Run out of glycogen, or even at the end of endurance rides, I've had it a few times where you start to feel hollow, or those little inclines that are usually nothing. And I've had it where cycling back home, coming through Dice, and there's a little climb up like Dice Drive, and it's not even a hill, it's just a slight elevation. If I'm starting to struggle, that feels like Everest. I'm going up this hill, it's like literally just trying to get to the end of it. If you start to feel that hollow feeling, that's usually a sign that glycogen is starting to get low. But if you do run to the point where you get very close to low glycogen, your body will force you to slow down. Usually. Now, some people can push beyond that, because nobody really knows if it's just glycogen or fatigue, mental. There's a lot of factors that contribute to it, but if you are starting to run low on fuel, your body starts to send these signals out pretty quickly. But basically, we need to be able to utilize fat at a race intensity or consume enough carbohydrates, or somewhere in the between them both. Now, if we can get by on using whole fat, we can probably race at quite a high intensity. If we're burning a lot of carbohydrate, we're probably going to have to slow down, and we're probably going to have to eat a lot. So I'll show you how this kind of looks in a couple of examples. Generally speaking, you can only combust somewhere in the region of 1 to 2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram per minute, roughly. Obviously it varies. Somewhere in the ballpark of 60 to 120 grams per hour is usually what most people could tolerate. If you've tried to eat 120 grams of carbohydrate, that's a lot of carbohydrate. That's like 6 gels an hour. And do that over, if you're going to be 6 hours, that's a lot of nutrition. Although a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of research at the moment where, depending on, this is in the energy talks, I won't go too deep into it, different fuel sources allow you to consume more fuel, and a lot of like elite cyclists now are 120 grams glycogen, carbohydrate combustion rates. For most of us, we're probably going to start having problems with our gut if we try and eat that. But it is trainable. You can train your gut to handle more carbohydrate. But again, that's in training, that's not on race day. You don't want to learn to see if you can do 100 grams on race day. Otherwise, you probably won't, but you'll be in the port loop. It's often a big limiter for the intensity you'll be able to sustain. So, to hopefully explain some of that and where we're going with this in a minute, and hopefully time-wise we're going to look to, still got 10 slides to go. So what we've got, this is basically from a maximal ramp test. It can be bike or run, doesn't change dramatically. You've got there, which is set, so the VO2 max, anybody know VO2 max? That is your max aerobic oxygen uptake. So that is the maximum amount of oxygen you can ultimately take in. Yeah, so that sets our ceiling for most of us. Genetically driven in a lot of areas. If you're new to training, it can probably still be improved. But basically that just sets, that's how much oxygen I can fundamentally get in. Now if you've got 80 millilitres of oxygen, that's considered very, very high, that's pretty close to elite. But it's how well you can use that oxygen and convert it into mechanical work on a bike or mechanical running. Yeah, now that does change between different people. And I'll go into a little bit of 2 different people. So anaerobic threshold, that was what we call our FTP. It's got a few million names, but functional threshold, it's about the intensity you could run 10k at, give or take. It's about the intensity you could probably sustain for 30, 40, maybe an hour on the bike. Swim, it's probably about what you could do for 1500, give or take. Aerobic threshold, so when we speak about zone 2, that is what we're speaking about. That point kind of intersects when we go from our zone 2 into zone 3. Yeah, that's when we go more into tempo. And I'll explain what that looks like here. So what this is here is the same data from the previous one, but it also looks at the rate that the person's breathing, so it's your ventilatory rate. Yeah, and what you see initially, so I should have said what oxygen everything was. Oxygen is the green, so this is ventilation over oxygen, and ventilation over CO2, so that's how much CO2 we're producing. Blue's heart rate, which we don't need to worry about. As you start exercising, so let's just say I got you now, right, all to stand up and start doing exercise, running on the spot, whatever, right? At low intensity, your body can get the additional oxygen in by just breathing deeper. So you take a bigger breath in, and you keep doing that. Go faster, a bit more of that, a bit more of that. There becomes a point, and everyone's different, where you get to a point where you can no longer meet the energy demand by just breathing deeper. You have to start also breathing faster. That's what that green start kick up happening at the bottom there with the vertical blue line, because that's the first physiological change the body's had to make an adaptation from. So it's had to go, right, I need to change something here, whereas before it didn't have to change anything, it just had to take in more air. And then as you exceed that, breathing rate starts to go up. That's why when people speak about zone 2, they tell you that it's the place where you can have a conversation at. Because if I'm taking a deeper breath, yeah, so that's fine. Yeah, as soon as I start struggling to be able to take that deep breath and still have a conversation, that's the point that my ventilatory rates start to increase. Yeah, and for a lot of people, it's also the point where we see carbohydrate metabolism start to ramp up quickly because you're struggling to get enough oxygen. The way to think about zone 2 or aerobic threshold is the point where the aerobic system just starts to struggle. It's not working that hard, it's just going, right, I need some help here. So it starts to ask the anaerobic system to kind of top it up a little bit. And then you go up to anaerobic threshold. I'm not going to go too deep into that, so we'll be here all night. That makes sense? Kind of? So what does that look like, I think, in terms of 2 people? So, same graph, athlete A, right? So this is someone who I would say has got quite a good aerobic threshold, because you can see it happens later. Now the later it happens, the better. Or the higher the power, the faster the speed, it happens, the better. If you were an elite marathon runner, for example, that zone 2 pace is probably at 6 minutes or 5:30 per mile. If you're an amateur marathon runner, it's probably at 9 kilometers an hour, like 11 minutes per kilometer. The further along it goes, and this is where there's a lot. Anybody heard of polarized training? Some people, maybe 80-20, a few different names for it. What people often speak about is you want to do, and kind of agree in some ways, but before that blue line, you want to do 8% of your training. 20% of training should be done above the kind of green line. True for a lot of people, it's generally a good guide for most, but if you're an elite athlete, that point is very far along. So you actually don't have a bit in the middle. So what I mean by that is these two lines here come closer together. Where an amateur athlete, I'll show you an example of that, is further down here. They've got very poor aerobic conditioning, massive bit in the middle where it's kind of no man's land, and then their threshold's maybe here. And that's really true for a lot of people, certainly if you've come from a background of faster running, faster biking, or whatever. But if we look at that compared to a second athlete, pretty much as soon as they started riding the bike, boof, I think it was a bike or it might have been a run, I can't remember now, but as soon as they started exercising, the body went into needing some help from the aerobic system. Both similar athletes, which I think is certainly up to a point, they're quite similar. Now, what we get from this now, there's a lot of data that comes in to get this, but what we get from, so athlete A here, from that data we've then calculated how much carbohydrates they're burning per gram per hour. So what you can see is the orange line is mapping carbohydrate utilization, and fat is mapping, blue is mapping fat utilization, and the green bar is setting that roughly 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrate you can probably consume per hour. That makes sense? It's quite a lot of things to say. Basically, so when we exceed that green bar and go above it, that's generally the point where we're probably going to struggle to meet the demand of carbohydrate we're using. Yeah. So ideally, we want to stay below that, and the below that, the better. And the faster you can go before that point occurs, the better you're probably going to be at metabolizing fat for fuel from that. So you can see there, this person never got to the point where even at 3:45 per kilometre, and we know that because they're a good endurance athlete, they still weren't burning more carbohydrate than they were able to consume. So they're not going to see glycogen depletion rate happen for a long, long time. And I'll show you what that looks like as well. Whereas athlete B, and I'll put some numbers on it just to kind of, if you can read that on the screen. So pretty much 6 kilometers per hour, they're burning 65, so they can maybe keep up with that. But still quite a lot of carbohydrate. As soon as they go to 30 per kilometre, they're at 83 grams, so they're starting to go above the kind of 80, 90 grams. As soon as they go up to 5 minutes per kilometre, they're burning 140 grams of glycogen per hour. They're going to run out of fuel pretty quickly if they're not taking. They need to take in more fuel, otherwise they're going to unravel very quickly. So then we look at this. So this is basically calculating the rate of glycogen depletion based on that. And I'll hopefully explain this properly because we're already out of time. But the blue bar here is if they were to continue at that intensity. So this is about the race intensity with no fueling, how long they would last. Now, if they're going to, I think it was in the run most of the states from, they could probably run for 4 hours, theoretically, before glycogen depletion occurs, without fueling at all, because they're very efficient at burning fat for fuel. If they increase their fueling, so the orange dots here, is if they consume 40 grams per hour, which is quite moderate in a lot of cases. They can almost double how long they can go for. Now, if they go to 60 grams, keeps going, goes to, I think, I can't remember what it goes up to, it's like 13 or 14 hours. If they go to the kind of 80 grams per hour, they're probably keeping glycogen depletion almost zero. They're actually probably topping it back up again. Whereas athlete B is pretty quickly, 2.5 hours, they're going to run out of fuel. Now, if they can run relatively well, now they're probably going to burn glycogen on the bike as well, so they're probably not going to be able to run without fueling, or they're going to have to go very slow. As they go even 40 grams per hour, it doesn't change dramatically. Now, it does start to extend at 60 and 80 grams, but for the same theoretical race pace, though the race pace is slower, they have to eat more and more fuel, otherwise they're just not going to make it at the end. Does that make sense? Okay. It's quite difficult to explain that without showing you all the other data as well. So what does this tell you? Why does it matter? So athlete A has a better aerobic conditioning, so they've prioritised their aerobic fitness more, which allows them to continue burning fat as they go faster, which is obviously going to help them on race day because they're going to be able to run at a faster speed. Again, races at higher intensity. Athlete B probably needs to improve their aerobic fitness. They need to get better using oxygen so that they're not burning as much carbohydrate, and that will actually improve their ability to go faster. And it's like Ken did a talk similar with people on a bike, which kind of similar kind of a scenario. They basically need to race at a lower intensity. So they're going to take longer in the race because they have to race at slower speeds. Otherwise, it's not going to end well. And they also need to increase carbohydrate during exercise and training. They're more likely to get ill, injured in training because of the amount of glycogen they're going to burn. So even out for an endurance ride, they're going to be burning a lot more carbohydrate. So they need to keep on top of it. Otherwise, they'll get to the end of the ride, they'll deplete that glycogen, training again tomorrow. They're maybe not topping it up. 3-4 weeks in, start to get ill, start to get injured. And that's quite common for a lot of people to happen to. You get 3-week blocks, great, and then they tail off. 3 weeks recovery, back to 3 weeks, and it's partly because they're not able to eat enough carbohydrates consistently to stop them feel, or they're trying to lose weight and they don't eat enough full stop. So what controls this? So I said there, more endurance training. Maybe, might be they've done more. Maybe they're just more disciplined at doing the aerobic endurance training. So when they say they're going out for aerobic endurance rides, and coming on to Natasha's question earlier, maybe that's the not saying you should definitely do that, but maybe the difference between the two of them is that person is quite comfortable, he doesn't care for Strava and wants to walk up a hill. That can sometimes be the big difference because they're always training the right intensity. They're not trying to go for ego and make it look good. They probably have less muscle mass in reality. Unfortunately, if you naturally have more muscle mass, you're probably going to have more slow twitch muscle fibers and less fast twitch muscle fibers, meaning you're not very good at sprinting. So if you're athlete A and you can't sprint very well, you're probably better at burning fat for fuel in most cases. Whereas if you're very good at sprinting, you're probably going to burn through glycogen a lot faster because slow twitch muscle fibers tend to rely more on fat, fast twitch muscle fibers need glycogen. So it does come back to depending on how you are built, unfortunately. But if you feel you run out of energy after about 2 hours, so you go out for a 2-hour bike ride with your mates and you noticeably start to feel you're slowing down, noticeably feel your heart rate starts to rise, the effort goes up exponentially, that's probably an indicator you need to do more aerobic training. Again, same thing. Do you find that as soon as you start running with your mate, they're struggling to have a conversation where you can quite happily chat to them all day long? That's also an indicator that your endurance is limited, or their endurance is limited. I'm not going to go too much into heart rate decoupling, but in theory, the basic is there. If you were to go and run at a steady effort, or ride at a steady effort on a relatively flat road, does your heart rate and pace or power stay relatively coupled together? What you'll see with someone an hour and a half in, it's a test you can actually do to test this, go out and run for an hour and a half, and see what your heart rate and pace does. If you feel you get to like an hour 15, you start to slow down and your heart rate stays the same, or same pace, heart rate starts to drift off, that's a sign that you're decoupling. And that's something that you then want to get to an hour 15 and gradually do more of it. So you don't want to go into 2 hours because you'll probably go. Now if you see both of them going the other way, that's the worst case scenario where you're slowing down and your heart rate's continuing to rise. And people, you'll see it happen, it'll happen to you at some point. You just probably haven't seen it and looked at it. That's why at the end of a marathon you'll see your heart rate can get really high, because your heart's having to work so hard because it's struggling to get enough oxygen through the system. So nutrition, nutritional issues. Who suffers from nutritional issues? Most people. If you've not, then you've not experienced life. So running out of fuel, hitting the wall is obviously a nutritional issue. With the line with what we said there, sometimes that's important. Often become progressively dehydrated because we're not drinking and eating enough. Gastro problems. And that's often basically because your body cannot break down the carbohydrate fast enough to get it into the bloodstream. So what happens is there it starts to swell up because it's trying to pull more water, which is why if you're eating carbohydrate, fuel or drinking carbohydrate, you need to make sure you're taking enough water. But if you're not, the stomach will try and get water, and that's why you get a bloated feeling or why you get like that stitch in most cases. Again, have a nutrition plan. If you have a nutrition plan, the likelihood of it going wrong is probably less. You're more likely to do it. Again, it's something that you've practiced. But how much and when? How much? If you're athlete B, you want to be trying to go towards the upper end. And you might say, I want to race a higher intensity race and I can't really improve my aerobic fitness huge amounts over the next 6 months or a year. I need to practice trying to see if my body can handle 80 grams or 100 grams per hour. If not, you're going to need to then change that maybe goal. But you might be able to do it because you can get to the point where your body can metabolize 80 grams per hour. And if you're using race nutrition, make sure you try and training, otherwise that's when you go in and straight back out, and not in the same place usually. So you prefer better to practice it. Sometimes I think in races the biggest thing people get wrong is the night before. They eat foods that they don't normally eat. You know, they go out to a pasta and it's a really rich sauce or it's creamy and whatnot, and it just doesn't agree with them. Sometimes if your race is really important and you find that sometimes you have gastro problems or stomach problems, you're potentially better to take your own food with you, you know, or rent an Airbnb or rent a place where you can cook your own. That sometimes saves the race in a lot of cases. Although if you've got a good stomach and you can eat anything, maybe you don't have to worry about it, and you're lucky on that side. Again, if we can make sure we're fueling well before, during, and after workouts, if you're athlete B, that could be your biggest limiter, is that you're just not replacing the glycogen enough to be able to stay consistent. So make sure you're prioritizing nutrition. We're almost there. Hydration. So make sure you hydrate well on the days before the race. That's really important and generally good. Although most people go the other extreme where they just drink loads of water and then end up diluting a lot of salt. You can go to the extreme of that where you get basically where your salts get diluted because you drank too much water. So you still want to have additional salt, still want to have carbohydrate in that. Obviously, the hotter the day, the more hydration you're going to prioritize. If you are racing in a climate that's silly hot, keeping the body cool is more important than getting carbohydrates in, because you'll probably overheat before you'll run out of glycogen in most cases. Like, so for example, in like Hawaii, 9 times out of 10 it's more overheating than it is running out of glycogen for most people. Now if you're going to race Hawaii, you want to practice that, get used to being in the heat. Again, drink with solid foods or gels. You're seeing now a lot of the brands come out with really concentrated gels. Again, it's a bit more into the nutrition talk. They're using slightly different sugars to do that, something called pectin. But it's like 80 grams in like a gel, or you're getting 80 grams in like a 500 ml bottle. That's a really concentrated amount of drink. You're probably going to need to add some water to that. Or you want to make sure that you've drank enough so that there's enough water in the stomach, otherwise that's where you're going to get problems. If you lose 1 to 2 kilos during the race, probably not a big issue. Any more than that might be a problem. Now your body's pretty good at working on kind of deprivation, so you can get beyond it. If you're like 10 kilos lighter on race day, you're probably not in a good place. You've probably not made it to the end. Again, don't overhydrate. General rule of thumb, depends on people, but if you get 3% dehydration, it can impact performance. If you get 10% dehydration, you're probably waking up in the middle of it, so you don't want to get there. And if you get hallucinations, it can also not be much fun. For a 70.3, it's doable, but it's not easy enough or easy to do as in a full Ironman, because the time unless you're at the lower end of the speed, it's harder to get to that complete point because the race generally is over quicker. But it's still important to know. Again, just some couple of things in gastro issues, things to generally try and avoid as much within reason. Fibre, so high fibre diet, high fat diet is something that can cause certainly high fibre. Obviously, it helps to pass everything. If you're eating lots of that on race day, it can also become a problem. Try to get tri-suit off quickly can also be hard. So reducing it, not to say don't avoid it, but reducing it in the couple of days before. Sometimes avoiding some fruits can be quite useful as well. Again, practice it as well. Reducing some fat as well in the kind of weeks or 2 weeks leading into the race can help with that. And again, avoid really concentrated energy drinks. But I think the key thing, we've probably all heard this and don't follow it, don't do anything you haven't practiced in training. Yeah, if you haven't done it before, why are you doing it in the race? A lot of the time what happens is, the race is coming up, panic, and then I start doing stuff that I wouldn't do. I buy the kit that I've never used before. It might be fine, but it might also not be fine. Obviously you can take the risk if you want, but I would say if you haven't practiced with it, you haven't used it, probably don't use it on race day. Now you can buy it at the expo if it's got a good deal, but you're better probably not to use it until maybe the next race. Because what if it doesn't work? Then you've just created a bigger problem. It happened with, Andy will tell me, what was the Scottish triathlete that went to Australia and Olympics or Comedy Games? Steph, yeah, Forster, yeah. So as a triathlete went, she had a wetsuit she never used before, and she got stuck in it, and she probably would have won the race in reality. Now that's another level of problem that hopefully none of us have to worry about. But if it's an important race for you, it's still important if something doesn't go right. And you,
team managers, it was a Triathlon Scotland, but
no, there you go. Again, have a nutrition and hydration plan. Like all these things, the more you plan, the better you're going to likely to execute a good race. If you follow it and it doesn't work, you can learn from it. But if you don't follow it and something happens, you're going to kick yourself because actually I didn't do what I said I was going to do. But as I'll be mindful of, you're probably going to have to adapt it because it doesn't work on race day, whatever, or you miss a gel, or you drop a gel, drop a bottle. You might have to think again. It's not too rigid. So some common training mistakes. Remember to do that? I spoke about that a bit earlier. Doing the endurance runs slightly too hard or rides slightly too hard. Really easy to do. Again, if it feels really easy, go slightly longer. So if you can do an hour really comfortably, try and do an hour and a half. You can do an hour and a half, try and do 2 hours. You can do 2 hours, do 2.5. You're better to extend that first. If you see that, again, I always look at sometimes if people are getting a lot of decoupling, don't keep extending it. Just keep getting to that point where the decoupling starts to happen until you see the decoupling happen a little bit less. But yeah, do the endurance rides. If you do it slightly too easy, you're probably still going to improve quite a lot. If you do it slightly too hard, it's probably going to impact you quite a lot. Again, most people run faster than race pace. I've seen it more for Ironman again, but I've seen a lot of people where the speed that they're running at, their endurance runs at, is faster than what they're probably going to run on race day. And they get off the run at race day and start going, phew, because they can't run it. And it's partly because they don't have enough aerobic fitness, because they're never training it properly. So you're better to do your training slightly too slow, and on race day, see it go up because you feel great and because you're getting your feeling right, rather than be training at 5 minutes a kilometre and on race day end up at 6:30s or 7s and you have to walk some of it because you're blown up. So yeah, running at race pace and getting used to running race pace. If you get off the bike and you feel amazing in your training, that's great, but slow it down. You're better to probably back it off and go, right, I'm going too fast. I know I can't run 4:10 per kilometre off the bike, So I need to slow that right down. Even if you feel amazing, you're better to back it off rather than get used to running faster in on race day. Complain why you end up having to walk most of it. Not progressing their training over time is probably the most important thing. Being able to gradually add some load to that. Not every session needs to progress. I think some people think every session has to go 10% more. It doesn't. As long as over a block of training you are progressing in some manner. Yeah. For a lot of people, if you're not training like a lot or you're not training to schnow, progressing your training is just actually adding that additional session on, or even adding an extra couple hundred meters to your warm up, your cool down, or your main set, whatever, is a good way to progress the session without necessarily anything crazy. Yeah. Not having a race plan, really common. Again, the more plans you have, the more likely you're going to get it right. But also not modifying your race plan as training progresses. Most people want our training plan to progress in the manner that we are able to go faster than what we initially envisioned. But likewise, if for whatever reason you haven't managed to get training in, you've been crazy busy with work, family, whatever has taken over, sometimes you need to think about that race plan stage. Is I want to change my goal slightly. So I know I'm not going to be able to bike for 3 hours. I need to back that off. Let's go for 3:20. Rather than go there and go, I'm still going to do 3 hours, and it's probably not going to happen. You're going to try and do 3 hours, blow up, and then hate yourself and be frustrated because it didn't go to plan. So you're better to go, right, I need to make an adjustment. I think 3:15 is a good target now based on what I've been doing. Make that adjustment, you can then execute a better race. And you might get to the end and go, actually, maybe I could have done 3:10 or 3 rather than the other way around. Oh, I was going for 3 but ended up doing 4. Yeah, again, focusing on your strengths. Most people do that stuff too much, so I'm good at it, so I want to keep doing more of it. Now, obviously, if you enjoy doing it, that's why you're probably good at it, but just focusing on your strengths is probably not going to help you in race day, certainly if it's endurance or if it's general strength. And again, not being specific, not training for your event, not doing some quality training, just going out and doing lots of zone 2 training isn't necessarily going to help you either. But if you're training for a hilly race, never riding on the hills, that's a problem. Or likewise, although here it's less of a problem, you're more likely to go the other way, where you get good at doing the hills and rubbish on the flat. But being specific as much as possible. Something as well I've put in, doing lots of hard group rides in the specific phase. Not always a problem for some people, but in a group ride, even if it's a social group ride, there's different effort. It's like more of a surging, someone goes a bit hard up a hill, you chase them down. That effort is so different to what you're going to need to do, or should be different to what you do on race day. So sometimes you're better to go, right, I get into my specific phase, sorry clubmates, I'll see you after the race in July, and focus on going out and riding comfortably steady. Again, if the weakness is you don't enjoy riding on your own, obviously the safety is an issue, it's not always a bad thing. Maybe go out with one more person rather than a big group, because then you can control the intensity a lot better and you're probably going to gain more from it. Rather than go out for 3 hours, I've done a 3 hour ride, but actually it's not helped you, it's made you more tired. So it's trying to manage that. Not that you shouldn't socialise, I'm not saying a lot of triathletes are pretty unsociable, but again, not including brick sessions is really common. We kind of ignore them and wonder why we can't run well off the bike. If you struggle to run off the bike, do more of them. Just bring them in sooner. You can do them any time of the year. There's not really an ideal time, but certainly do more of it. Again, not practicing race nutrition, not getting enough recovery. I think we're all guilty of that. We don't get the sleep right. Again, that comes back to if you're not getting enough recovery, make that one of your process goals. Prioritise my recovery between sessions, prioritise my recovery, take some rest days. Maybe I need to adjust my training plan to give me more rest days. That potentially helps you improve. But lack of consistency is probably the biggest thing for people training. If you want to improve, you need to be consistent over time rather than say a hero for 6 months in February and then injured and out for the rest of the season. Yeah, and then repeat the cycle 3 years in a row. So a couple of things just here. We're on to 2 more slides. Common race mistakes. Again, you don't have a plan for the race. Not taking account to race conditions. It happened. I've seen it actually when we did the half marathon here in Aberdeen when it was crazy hot. Everybody that I know went out at the target intensity and it was so hot, everybody blew up. Whereas the people who probably went, actually a bit hot here, I'm going to start a wee bit easier, or even thinking I'm going to take more water with me and actually pace it well, and if I feel good at halfway I can always pick it up rather than go, right, I'm going to run this time and then halfway through body overheats, kaboom. So yeah, make sure you take account of changes in race day. If it's a choppy swim, you're going to have to account for that. You're going to probably swim slower. If it's really windy on the bike, where is it going to be windy? Maybe you think, right, it's going to be windy for the first half of the ride, so I just need to prioritise and make sure that I'm prepared for it rather than just hope that it doesn't be windy. Said that, using untried or new equipment, ignoring race nutrition plan, not knowing the course and nutrition and transition layouts. That's something you want to know inside out. They give you all the information, certainly if it's a big branded event. They'll give you where the transitions are, what times you need to do all these things. Most people go, what time is this at? Read the manual. It's always in there. It's 90% of the time. I'd be very surprised if they don't give you all that information. Make sure you know the course, know where the hills are, know where transition is, know if there's parts of the course that could cause you a problem in terms of the potholes or whatever, whether you can ride it, run it. That all helps you on race day. And the world's amazing now. The fact you can go on Google and you can probably get every single corner. I have done it for races where I've sat there on Google Earth just for a long course, because it just allows you to visualize. If you can't go and recce the course, it just helps you, right? I know up this hill there's a tree or whatever. I know to expect that. I'm looking for that on race day. I know when the top of the hill comes. Rather than you go up the hill, right, I reach the top, come around the corner and it's going up twice as far. Starting the bike too hard, you feel great. You just come out and swim, you maybe have the best swim of your life, hopefully because you've done the right training, and you go off the bike like a maniac. That can unravel you very quickly on a long day out. So don't go crazy on the bike. Sometimes you do go out a little bit harder just because it's congested, not always a bad thing, but be mindful of, and again, part of your plan should be, right, I know I'm going to go a wee bit hard for the first 5-10 minutes, then I'm going to check on what's my heart rate doing, how hard does it feel, I'll make an adjustment based on that. And just because you're going well doesn't mean you are. Variability, which I covered a little bit. Unfortunately, sometimes you get beaten up in the swim, but what I've said here is avoid trying to fight. How many times you got someone smack you in the back of the head or in the feet and you're like, rah, go into Hulk smash and try and drown them. But I guess especially avoid trying to fight the water. That comes into swim technique. Don't fight the water doesn't get tired, you will. So I think learning to relax in the water, even if there's a lot of people swimming over the top of you, if you need to, breaststroke, move out the way, let the kind of crazy people go past, and then get into your own rhythm, rather than try and fight them and spend half the swim just trying to punch number 320 or whatever in the head, and then get frustrated when you come out the swim and you're slower and you're exhausted. So yeah, trying to relax in the swim is important. So conclusions, just so I don't keep you here hostage any longer. Make a plan for a training and for a race. So map out that year sooner rather than later. Once you've got an event certainly in the diary, make that initial draft plan. Make your race plan as you get into that last phase is really, really important and will make a big difference. Which I guess comes into people don't plan to fail, they fail to plan, which is usually what happens. Make sure you're developing aerobic endurance, prioritise that. If I can only give you one advice, focus on that more than anything, you'll probably make improvements. Working on your weaknesses, which for a lot of us is probably aerobic endurance. Also be specific to the event. Make your training progressive. You need to be able to progress it over time. If you can't do that, as I say, you're going to go backwards. Make sure you do some brick training. Practice everything before the race. Nutrition is important, did I mention that? In the race and in training. This is something that I think we all forget about sometimes, is have fun and learn from any training and racing mistakes. I've learned more from races and events that I've not done well, and there's been a few events where it really haven't gone well. If you make the same mistake 3 races in a row, you probably need to learn the advice, but have fun with it. I think we often get caught up on, I didn't hit my time, I was rubbish, and then we come away from it negative. And I think it was Chrissy Weldon said with like age groupers, so we were age groupers, is like, the biggest mistake they make is they cross the finish line, boom. And rather than like, yeah, amazing, I crossed the finish line. And I almost think you want to just think, right, they crossed that finish line. What went well, what didn't go well. You almost need someone to interview, right, give me the race plan, how did it go? Right, not before you even know time and placing. Hannah Miley does good stuff. So she's had her best ever race when she was 4th at Olympic Games. Like, it sounds weird, like obviously when the numbers and the quality is a lot higher, but that was the race she said she couldn't have gone any better. Like, it was the best race she ever had. Obviously she wanted to win a medal, but nothing more she could have done. But it's like this, she like touched the wall, oh my god, it's amazing, turned around, oh, 4th. And like, amazing that can like sink you, even though it's been maybe the best race. So like, have fun. You'll probably make mistakes. You'll probably not get it right, but don't get too caught up in it. Your life's not going to change. Even if you win the race, you're probably not going to become a celebrity overnight, unfortunately. And there's a good interview with David McNamee, so a Scottish Ironman, kind of got some of the best performances at Ironman, being multiple 3rd at Kona. And Bob Babbitt, who does a lot of interviews, asked him, so like, what's changed? It's like, nothing. He says, I still have to take my bins out, still have to do my dishes. Like, he's a professional athlete, so he obviously gets paid to, but nothing really changes, and we're even more so. Like, you're still going to have to go to work the following week. Now, yeah, you can maybe have a nice shiny medal to show off to people, but nothing's probably going to change in reality. So I think making sure you're having fun in training, learn from mistakes, do those things, and make mistakes. Don't be scared of it. Any questions? And then I'll just put some dates of other talks. So if anybody wants more on the endurance one, if you're not signed up, there is the nutrition one that's there. I'm going to go into a bit more detail into that nutrition stuff. We're only 20 minutes over, it's not too bad. Sorry for keeping you hostage.
Should you think about what zone you're racing in?
Yeah, that's a good question. Never covered that again. This is one I could have probably could have done in 2 talks. Generally speaking, it's kind of that zone 2, zone 3 for most people. Depends on how long it's going to take.
For racing?
Yeah. Depending on the faster you're going, the higher intensity you're going to ultimately to race at. I think the big thing is probably trying to make sure the heart rate's not too high. If you're using power on the bike, it's really important. But I think it's more like, actually, if your heart rate's sitting higher than you think is sustainable and what you've maybe been doing right, slow it down, bring the heart rate back down, and be kind of diligent with that. I think the risk is you go, my heart is high, I feel great, keep going, and then at some point you start to unravel really quickly. But yeah, generally speaking, for most people, if you're kind of in that kind of 6.5, 7 hour kind of category, most of the race is probably going to be upper zone 2 into zone 3, and you're probably going to run in zone 2 in reality. So that's why aerobic threshold is really, really critical. Yeah.
With what my husband's a lot of zone 2, and I know there's a method to figuring it out in terms of, he said you like beast up the hill and you can't beast anymore, rather than do the maths on that.
Yeah.
Is there a better way to do it than that?
I mean, so that's generally working out threshold. So that's like, and again, like we tend to do as well, where you base a percentage of threshold. It's generally good, but what you've seen is 2 people, they can have the same threshold, but that zone 2 point can be vastly different. Like that 2 athletes, they could have the exact same threshold power pace, but the point that aerobic threshold kicks in is massively different, and you won't get that as a percentage. The easiest thing to do is go out for a run. Can you have a conversation? Can you chat to someone? Rather easy. And I say for a lot of us, you probably will have to walk at periods to bring everything down, and that's the bit that's usually humbling and quite hard initially because you don't want to walk. But it's like you go in there, breathing starting to go up, and starting to feel that ventilation rate change. Right, slow it down. If you can't slow it down, walk for a minute, 30 seconds, and then aim to run again. Again, the goal would be over time, and that's something you can make a note of. Is right. Yeah, I've got to be 20 minutes, and my heart rate starts to rise. I start feeling breathing go. Right, next week you want to go. Right, I ran for an hour before that point happened, and it was good. And you should gradually over time see the speed either increase or the heart rate will come down for the same speed. Any other questions? Hopefully everybody got something useful from it. So it's quite hard to do. Ken was the same last week, I think. It's because there's such a range. It's like if you're going to go for a 4 hour half to an 8 hour half, different training and different intensity. But generally, I think the key thing for me is mapping out a plan. Even it doesn't have to be perfect. You probably won't get it perfect, but mapping out roughly on these are the phases I want to do. These are the general training I'm going to do in it. As long as you're generally progressing, you're probably 90% going to get it right. It's usually when you stop sticking to the plan, you read an article online that tells you that doing these intervals are the best session to do a 7.3 faster, and then you jump into that. Ken said that last week. You're constantly jumping from different session, and it doesn't then progress. It's just that session, that session, that session. There's no real progression over time, and your body then just stops adapting the same way, or you just do too much too soon, and you get ill or injured.
Well, like the bike being the most important part are like aero bars.
Yeah.
Like if you've got a road bike, you know, you get the clip-on bars. Or some races that say they don't allow that for some reason. Have you seen that? I feel
No,
like I've heard that somewhere.
No, most unless it's like a so we call a drafting event, although middle distance training isn't. But yeah, you should be able to use, and it's a worthwhile thing. I mean, I did take there was some stuff in the talk initially about like position on the bike is quite important as well. Again, if you're looking for performance, there is loads of things you can do. You can spend a lot of money nowadays on getting the kit to make you faster. But that is probably a simple thing. If you've got a road bike, you don't have the money or don't want to invest in a time trial bike, that's probably a lot of money you can save and gain from.
Yeah, because like middle versus Ironman, would you make a lot of gain by having aero bars?
Yeah, it's probably the first thing I would do. If you said, right, I've got £150 to spend, or I've got a budget of however much, that would be where you'd probably spend your money first.
Would you train a lot with the aero bars?
Yeah, you start to train on them as much as possible, because the position is different.
Even in your like zone 2, well.
Yeah, just get comfortable in it. Again, I mean, it's probably going to be close to race intensity. If you're doing Ironman, it'll be the intensity you're going to race Ironman at. Yeah, getting comfortable in it. Now again, the thing with, like, not to try and sell TT bikes, but the thing with TT bikes is they are naturally bringing you further forward, so that position is a lot more comfortable. Whereas on a road bike, it's a kind of compromise. But it can work. Plenty of people have done it. You know, like Andrew there, he did Nissan on a bike with clip-on bars on.
On an Ironman?
Yeah. So it's not, you don't need to buy a TT bike.
You can adjust the seat as well.
Yeah, there's loads of things you can do.
Make
It's
adjustments
like,
to make it work for you.
yeah, it's
But
again.
definitely do it. If you plan to do that, all your training should be done on that bike. And if it don't work, change the bike. Because that's not 3 hours you want.
But again, for like, if you're going to do, so if you're going to be out there for, let's say it's an Ironman over, let's speak about Ironman, but if you're going to be out half for an Ironman for a long time, comfort's more important than speed. So you'd rather have someone get off the bike feeling comfortable, someone off the bike, yeah, I've saved 10 minutes being on aero bars, but now I can't run. That's going to cost you an hour, because you're going to be, hoping, as most people get to, in an Ironman. Whereas if you can be comfortable for that ride, get off feeling good, that's going to so yeah, it's comfort. As your distance go up, comfort becomes more important than speed in most cases. Not slowing down is probably the big thing. Slow down less is the key. Cool. Alright, that's it. Hopefully, if anybody thinks of any questions that after they leave and they're not asking, feel free to give me a shout. So yeah, hopefully you got something from that. Thank you.